cold Alpha King bought a mute Omega from her abusive pack, then discovered she could speak. Snow was falling when the coldest man in the mountains stepped into the trading post and laid silver on the counter for a broken woman who hadn't said a word in years. Folks thought she was silent because she was afraid. They didn't know she was guarding something dangerous, something that could bring down men more feared than winter itself. He only meant to give her shelter. But one night, by the glow of a single lamplight, her voice broke the silence, and with it came a secret that could set the whole valley on fire. Now, with riders watching the ridges and a name carved in his door, every choice he makes will decide whether she finds freedom or the pack drags her back into the dark. Before we begin, I invite you to take a breath. This space is for the quiet believers, the ones who know small kindnesses can ripple into something greater. Through the frosted windows of Wolf Creek Trading Post, weak January sunlight cast long shadows across weathered floorboards. Caleb Rourke stomped snow from his boots as he entered, the weight of fresh pelts heavy across his broad shoulders. The familiar sense of tobacco, leather, and wood smoke filled the cramped space. But something else caught his attention: the sharp tang of cheap whiskey and unwashed bodies drifting from the back room. He moved quietly despite his size, years of cavalry scout training evident in his careful steps. The pelts could wait. Something about the raised voices drawing him toward the partially open door made his jaw tighten. In the dim light of the back room, 3 Apache men in worn clothing stood facing Bill Sutter, the trader whose bloodshot eyes and swaying stance betrayed his drinking. Between them stood a young woman, her dark hair falling forward to hide her face. The threadbare blanket wrapped around her thin shoulders did little to conceal the way she trembled. "Deal's done," Sutter slurred, jabbing a finger at the men. "She covers what you owe me for the whiskey. Fair trade." Caleb's hands clenched at his sides. The woman hadn't moved, hadn't made a sound, but he could see the purple-black bruises circling her wrists like cruel bracelets. His cold blue eyes narrowed as he took in the scene, noting how the Apache men wouldn't meet anyone's gaze. "Ain't that right, girl?" Sutter grabbed her chin roughly, forcing her face up. Though she didn't resist, Caleb caught a flash of something in her eyes. Not defeat, but a carefully banked fire. "How much?" Caleb's voice cut through the tense air like a knife. Sutter spun around, nearly losing his balance. "This ain't your business, Rourke." "I'm making it my business." Caleb stepped fully into the room, his tall frame filling the doorway. "Name your price." The trader's piggy eyes gleamed with greed. $20 silver. She ain't worth more, being damaged goods and all." Without hesitation, Caleb pulled out his money pouch and counted out the coins, letting each one ring as it hit the scarred wooden table. He didn't haggle, couldn't stomach treating her like common goods to be bargained over. The Apache men melted away into the shadows as Sutter snatched up the money. Caleb turned to the woman, keeping his movements slow and deliberate. "Come with me," he said softly. When she didn't move, he added, "You're safe now." "I won't harm you." She followed him without a word, her steps silent as a ghost. Outside, the wind had picked up, driving needle-sharp snowflakes into their faces. Caleb helped her onto his sturdy pack horse, noting how light she was, how her hands were raw with cold. "Hold tight," he instructed, swinging up behind her. "Storm's coming. We need to make it to my ranch before it hits." They rode in silence through the deepening afternoon. The woman remained perfectly still against him, though she must have been freezing. Caleb kept one arm wrapped protectively around her waist, guiding his horse along the familiar trail as snow began falling more heavily. His small log cabin appeared through the swirling white just as dusk was settling in. It wasn't much, a single room with a stone fireplace, rough-hewn furniture he'd made himself, and windows sealed against the mountain winters. But it was warm and safe, and right now, that was what mattered. Caleb helped her down from the horse, quickly leading the animal into the nearby barn. When he returned, she stood exactly where he'd left her, snow gathering on her blanket. "Come inside," he said, opening the cabin door. The remains of his morning fire still glowed, and he quickly added logs until flames leaped up, casting dancing light across the walls. He moved around the cabin with practiced efficiency, hanging their snow-dampened outer clothes near the fire and pulling out his largest pot. Soon, the rich smell of heating stew filled the small space. The woman hadn't moved from her spot near the door, watching his every movement with wary eyes. "Here." Caleb took his best quilt from the bed in the corner, offering it to her. "You're shivering. Wrap up in this while the stew warms." She accepted the quilt with slightly trembling hands, drawing it around herself like armor. Caleb pretended not to notice how she flinched when he passed close by to stir the pot. When the stew was hot, he filled 2 bowls, setting one on the table for her along with a spoon and a thick slice of bread. "Eat," he said gently. "You need it." He took his own bowl to the hearth, settling down on the floor near the fire to give her space. The woman hesitated for a long moment before sliding into the chair, though she didn't immediately touch the food. "It's not poisoned," Caleb said, keeping his voice light. "Just venison stew." "Made it myself," he demonstrated by taking a large spoonful of his own. Finally, she began to eat, small, careful bites at first, then with increasing hunger. Caleb said nothing more, letting the crackling fire and howling wind fill the silence. When she'd finished, he took both their bowls to his wash basin. "Take the bed," he said, nodding toward the corner. "I'll sleep here by the fire. Door's bolted, but I'll leave the key on the table. You can leave anytime you want, though I wouldn't recommend it until this storm passes." He arranged his bedroll on the floor, adding another log to the fire before settling down. The woman hadn't moved toward the bed, but he didn't press the issue. Instead, he closed his eyes, making his breathing slow and even, trying to appear as non-threatening as possible. The storm raged outside, but inside the cabin, an uneasy peace settled. Caleb kept his eyes closed, listening as she finally moved, her footsteps whisper quiet across the wooden floor. The bed creaked softly as she lay down, still wrapped in his quilt. He didn't sleep, maintaining his vigil by the fire, his thoughts troubled by the bruises he'd seen and the silence she maintained. Whatever her story was, he knew it couldn't be good. But for now, at least she was safe, and that would have to be enough. Dawn crept over the snow-laden mountains, painting the frost-covered windows in pale gold. Caleb stirred from his place by the banked fire, awareness coming quickly as years of frontier living had taught him. Something was different. The cabin already held the welcoming warmth of a freshly tended fire, and the familiar scent of wood smoke filled the air. He opened his eyes to find Ahyoka kneeling by the hearth, carefully adding small sticks to build up the flames. Her movements were precise and practiced, speaking of long experience with fire tending. The quilt he'd given her was wrapped securely around her shoulders, though she'd folded his blanket and set it aside. "Morning," he said softly, not wanting to startle her. She glanced up briefly before returning her attention to the fire, her long dark hair falling forward to shield her face. Caleb rose and moved to the kitchen area, deliberately making noise as he gathered what he needed for breakfast. He pulled out cornmeal, dried berries, and the last of his honey. A simple meal, but warming for a cold morning. While the porridge cooked, he snuck glances at his silent guest. She'd settled at the table, hands folded in her lap, head bowed. The morning light revealed fresh details he'd missed in yesterday's dim storm. Her clothes were worn but carefully mended, and though she was thin, there was a natural grace to her movements. He set a bowl before her, along with a spoon and a cup of hot coffee. "Eat while it's warm," he said, keeping his voice gentle. She picked up the spoon but waited until he'd settled with his own bowl before taking a bite. They ate in silence, broken only by the crack and pop of the fire. Ahyoka kept her eyes downcast, though she cleaned her bowl thoroughly. When Caleb rose to wash the dishes, she immediately gathered them up, moving to the wash basin before he could protest. "I need to check the stock in the lower pasture," he said, watching her efficient movements. "You should come along. Better than staying cooped up here alone." He paused, then added, "Unless you'd rather stay." She shook her head once, quick and definite. Caleb nodded, gathering their winter gear. He helped her into a spare coat that was far too big but would keep her warm, then led the way to the barn where his horses waited. The morning air bit sharp and clean, the storm having left behind a pristine white world. Caleb lifted Ahyoka onto his most gentle mare, noting how she settled naturally into the saddle despite its Western style. He mounted his own horse, and they set out along the trail that wound down toward the valley. Fresh snow draped every branch and boulder, transforming the familiar path into something magical. Though Ahyoka kept her head down, Caleb noticed her quick glances at the mountains rising majestically around them. Something in her expression softened when she looked at those snow-capped peaks, as though they spoke to something deep within her. They spent several hours checking fences and counting cattle, Caleb speaking quietly to explain what he was doing. Though Ahyoka never responded, she watched everything with keen attention, her dark eyes missing nothing. By the time they returned to the cabin, the short winter day was already fading. Caleb built up the fire while Ahyoka moved about the kitchen, setting water to heat for tea with the same quiet efficiency she'd shown that morning. As darkness gathered outside, Caleb noticed her standing by the window, one finger tracing delicate patterns in the frost that had formed on the glass. The designs reminded him of the intricate beadwork he'd seen on Apache clothing, flowing lines that might have been mountains or rivers, decorated with tiny star-like shapes. "Bitter cold tonight," he remarked softly, not really expecting a response. The wind had picked up again, rattling the shutters with its force. "Don't send me back." The words, barely more than a whisper, stopped Caleb in his tracks. He turned slowly, hardly daring to breathe, to find Ahyoka still facing the window, her hand pressed flat against the glass. "You can speak," he said, keeping his voice carefully neutral. She turned then, meeting his eyes for the first time. "I was never truly mute," she said, her voice clear as a mountain stream despite its softness. "I learned to hide my voice, to keep silent, so they couldn't make me tell what I know." Caleb remained very still, sensing the importance of this moment. "What do you know?" She shook her head, wrapping her arms around herself. "Things that would get people killed, things about Bill Sutter, about the men he deals with." Her voice grew stronger as she continued. "I saw things I wasn't supposed to see. Heard things they thought no one could hear. They would have forced me to tell them everything if they knew I could speak." The wind howled outside, making the cabin creak. Ahyoka moved away from the window, closer to the fire's warmth, though she kept her distance from Caleb. "Will you give me your word?" she asked, her dark eyes intense in the firelight. "Your word that you won't betray my trust? That you won't tell them I can speak?" Caleb met her gaze steadily. "I give you my word," he said, the promise carrying all the weight of his years of living by a strict code of honor. "No one will learn your secret from me." She studied his face for a long moment, as though reading the truth in his eyes. Finally she nodded, some of the tension leaving her shoulders. The wind rattled the shutters again, but inside the cabin, a different kind of silence had settled. Not the fearful quiet of before, but something more like peace. Morning sunlight streamed through the barn doors, catching dust motes in its golden beams. Caleb sat on an overturned crate, working oil into a worn leather bridle. The familiar task kept his hands busy while his mind turned over recent events. Ahyoka stood nearby, sorting through a pile of horse blankets that needed mending. The comfortable silence between them felt different now that he knew she could speak. He glanced up, watching as she efficiently folded a blanket, her movements precise and practiced. "Why did you choose to stay silent for so long?" he asked, keeping his voice gentle. "What made you fear speaking?" Ahyoka's hands stilled on the blanket. She looked toward the barn door, as though checking they were truly alone, before moving closer to where Caleb worked. "Bill Sutter," she said, her voice barely above a whisper despite their solitude. "He controls more than just the trading post. He has his fingers in everything. Land deals, cattle sales, even the reservation supplies." Caleb nodded slowly, having suspected as much. "Go on." She settled on a nearby hay bale, her fingers twisting in her skirt. 6 months ago, I was cleaning his office after hours. He didn't know I was there." Her voice grew stronger as she continued. I saw him hiding something behind a loose board in the wall, a leather-bound ledger. He was drunk, talking to himself about how it proved everything. All his false land claims, the way he's been cheating both my people and the local ranchers. That's a serious accusation, Caleb said, though he believed every word. He'd seen enough of Sutter's dealings to know the man's friendly manner masked a ruthless core. He has people everywhere, Ahyoka continued. Agency officials who look the other way when grazing permits suddenly change hands. Ranch foremen who help him move boundary markers in the night. She met Caleb's eyes. Even the sheriff takes his money. I've noticed his influence, Caleb admitted, setting aside the bridle. Good men who suddenly change their minds about land sales. Strange rulings when disputes come up. If he knew I'd seen that ledger... Ahyoka shuddered. I've watched him destroy people who crossed him. So I stopped speaking, became invisible. It was safer that way. Caleb understood her fear. Sutter's reach was long, and his revenge could be subtle but devastating. A man might find his cattle mysteriously dying, his water rights questioned, or worse. The morning passed as they worked together in the barn. Caleb showed Ahyoka the daily routine, grateful for her quick understanding and willing hands. By afternoon, they moved outside to tend to the other animals. Like this, Caleb demonstrated, scattering grain in a wide arc for the chickens. The plump hens rushed forward, pecking eagerly at the feed. He handed the bucket to Ahyoka, watching as she mimicked his movement perfectly. You've done this before, he observed. A small smile touched her lips. My grandmother kept chickens. Before ... She didn't finish, but Caleb understood. Before the relocations, before everything changed. They moved to the horse paddock next. Ahyoka showed no fear of the large animals, approaching them with quiet confidence. She offered hay to his old mare, speaking soft words in Apache that made the horse's ears prick forward with interest. The winter sun set early, painting the snow-covered yard in shades of pink and gold. Inside the cabin, they shared a simple supper of beans and cornbread. The silence between them felt easier now, weighted with shared understanding rather than fear. After the dishes were cleared, they sat by the fire to plan their next move. The snow should ease by the day after tomorrow, Caleb said, studying the flames. We can ride into town then, speak with the agency clerk, Thomas Brill. Ahyoka looked up sharply. Can he be trusted? Brill's not in Sutter's pocket, as far as I know. Too scared of him, if anything. Caleb poked at the fire, sending sparks dancing up the chimney. But he keeps the records. If we can convince him to look into Sutter's claims... He'll need proof, Ahyoka said softly. The ledger would show everything. But getting to it... She trailed off, the firelight casting shadows across her worried face. One step at a time, Caleb assured her. First, we talk to Brill, see what he knows, what he might be willing to do officially. Ahyoka nodded, though concern still lined her features. They discussed the details of their trip, when to leave, which trails to take, how to avoid drawing attention in town. Eventually, she retired to the small bedroom Caleb had given her, leaving him alone with his thoughts. He remained by the fire, feeding it small sticks as he considered the danger ahead. Going against Sutter meant risking everything he'd built here. His ranch, his reputation, maybe even his life. But looking the other way meant being part of the corruption that was slowly poisoning the territory. Outside, a lone coyote called into the night, its mournful howl echoing off the snow-covered mountains. The sound carried both warning and challenge in its wild voice. Caleb stared into the dying flames, knowing that tomorrow would bring them one day closer to confronting whatever waited in town. Dawn barely touched the eastern sky when Caleb and Ahyoka prepared for their journey to Wolf Creek. The storm had finally passed, leaving behind a pristine blanket of white across the landscape. Their breath formed clouds in the frigid morning air as they worked together to saddle the horses. Caleb tightened the cinch on his bay gelding, glancing at Ahyoka as she confidently prepared her own mount. She had borrowed his spare winter coat, the too large garment making her appear even smaller, but her movements were sure and steady. Ready? He asked, checking their saddlebags one final time. She nodded, pulling herself into the saddle with practiced ease. They set out just as the sun cleared the mountain peaks, their horses breaking trail through the fresh snow. The going proved slower than expected. Deep drifts blocked their usual path, forcing them to pick careful detours around the worst spots. Caleb led the way, choosing the safest route through the transformed landscape. The horses plowed forward, steam rising from their flanks despite the cold. By midday, both riders and mounts needed rest. Caleb guided them to a sheltered spot beneath a stand of pine trees, where the snow lay thinner on the ground. They dismounted, letting the horses catch their breath while pawing at patches of exposed grass. "Here," Caleb said, pulling dried jerky from his saddlebag. He handed several strips to Ayoka before settling on a fallen log. They ate in companionable silence, watching their breath mist in the winter air. "What if the clerk won't help?" Ayoka finally asked, voicing the concern that had shadowed their journey. Caleb chewed thoughtfully before answering. "Then we'll find another way, but Brill's our best chance at handling this legally." They mounted up again after the brief rest, pushing on through the afternoon. The sun hung low in the western sky by the time Wolf Creek's buildings came into view, their windows glowing amber in the fading light. The agency office occupied a narrow room behind the general store, accessed by a worn wooden walkway. Caleb helped Ayoka dismount, then tied both horses to the hitching post. A bell tinkled as they entered, announcing their presence to the clerk hunched over his desk. Thomas Brill looked up slowly, his wire-rimmed spectacles catching the lamplight. His gaze moved from Caleb to Ayoka, then back again, his expression carefully neutral. "Mr. Rourke," he acknowledged, "what brings you to town?" Caleb stepped forward, keeping his voice low but firm. "We need to discuss some irregularities with local land claims, specifically those involving Bill Sutter." Brill's eyelids drooped to half-mast, his fingers fidgeting with the papers before him. "Land claims, you say? Everything seems in order from what I can tell." "It's not in order," Ayoka spoke up, her clear voice filling the small space. "There's proof of fraud." The clerk's chair scraped back suddenly. He stood, glancing toward the window, then moved closer to them. "I'd strongly advise you to drop this matter," he muttered, his eyes darting toward the saloon across the street. "For your own safety, understand?" Caleb followed his gaze. Through the saloon's grimy windows, he could make out several of Sutter's men lounging at the bar. They seemed casual enough, but their presence felt deliberate, a reminder of who really controlled the town. "The law," Caleb began, but Brill cut him off with a sharp gesture. "The law is what's written in these books," the clerk said, patting a stack of ledgers. "And right now, everything appears perfectly legal. I suggest you leave it that way." The threat in his words hung heavy in the air. Ayoka's hand found Caleb's arm, her fingers tightening in warning. Outside, the wind had picked up, carrying the first bite of nightfall. They left without further argument, though frustration burned in Caleb's chest. The ride home would be dangerous enough without drawing more attention. Already, dusk was falling fast, the temperature dropping with the sun. The wind grew fiercer as they rode, driving loose snow into their faces. Caleb pulled his scarf higher, worried about Ayoka in the deteriorating conditions. But she rode steadily beside him, handling her mount with skill despite the darkness and cold. They pushed on through the gathering night, guided by Caleb's lantern and his deep knowledge of the trail. The horses seemed to sense their urgency, maintaining a steady pace despite their earlier exertion. Finally, the welcome sight of Caleb's ranch appeared through the gloom. Neither spoke as they cared for the horses, working efficiently in the relative warmth of the stable. The animals settled quickly with fresh hay and water, while Caleb and Ayoka gathered their gear with cold, numbed fingers. Inside the cabin, Ayoka moved straight to the stove, setting water to heat for tea while Caleb built up the fire. The familiar tasks helped ease some of the tension from the day, but the clerk's warning echoed in both their minds. When Ayoka pressed a steaming cup into his hands, Caleb nodded his thanks. They sat before the fire, letting its heat thaw their chilled bodies. Neither mentioned the implied threat they'd received, but its weight settled around them like a heavy blanket. The wind continued to howl outside, rattling the cabin's shutters and carrying away any words they might have spoken about their failed mission. Morning sunlight sparkled on the fresh snow as Caleb stepped out onto the cabin's porch. The storm had passed, leaving behind a crystalline world that glittered like diamonds. He breathed in the crisp air, watching as Ahyoka emerged from the cabin, wrapped in the thick wool coat he'd given her. "Thought we might try something different today," he said, nodding toward the barn. "Keep you close while I tend to things." Ahyoka followed him to the stable, where several horses peered over their stall doors. Caleb stopped in front of a gentle-eyed bay mare, her dark mane falling softly over her forehead. "This is Belle," he said, reaching up to scratch behind the mare's ears. "She's steady as they come. Thought you might like to learn to ride proper-like, not just sitting behind someone else." A small smile touched Ahyoka's lips as she extended her hand to the horse. Belle stretched her neck forward, sniffing the offered fingers before nickering softly. "She likes you," Caleb observed, retrieving a brush from the tack room. He showed Ahyoka how to groom the mare, explaining each step as they worked together. The repetitive motions seemed to relax them both, and soon Belle's coat gleamed in the morning light streaming through the barn doors. When it came time to saddle up, Caleb demonstrated each step carefully. "The cinch needs to be snug, but not too tight," he explained, showing her how to check the fit. "Horse can't breathe right if you overdo it." Ahyoka proved an attentive student, her quick hands mimicking his movements with natural grace. Once Belle was tacked up, Caleb led them to the corral beside the barn. "Now for the important part," he said, positioning himself next to the stirrup. "Mount up smooth and easy, like this." He demonstrated the proper technique, then dismounted to spot her first attempt. Ahyoka gathered the reins as he'd shown her, placed her foot in the stirrup, and swung up into the saddle with surprising agility. Caleb nodded approvingly, making minor adjustments to her position. "Keep your back straight but not stiff," he instructed, walking alongside as Belle ambled forward. "Let your hips move with the horse, that's it, you're a natural." They made slow loops around the corral, Caleb explaining the basics of rein pressure and leg cues, while Ahyoka absorbed every word. Her confidence grew with each circuit, and soon she was guiding Belle through simple turns and transitions without assistance. "You've ridden before," Caleb observed, noting her intuitive feel for the horse's movements. "Some," she admitted quietly. "But not like this. Not properly." They worked until the winter sun stood high overhead, then led Belle back to the barn for a well-deserved rest. After a simple lunch of beans and cornbread, Ahyoka surprised Caleb by taking his arm and leading him toward the tree line. "Let me show you something," she said, her voice carrying a hint of excitement. She pointed to marks in the snow near the forest's edge. "See these tracks?" Caleb knelt beside her, examining the delicate impressions. "Rabbit?" "Yes," she nodded, moving a few steps further. "And here, fox prints, see how they're different, more precise, with claw marks showing." Her fingers traced the air above the tracks, demonstrating the pattern. They spent the next hour following various trails through the snow, Ahyoka teaching him to distinguish between different animals' prints. She showed him how deer tracks told stories of feeding patterns, and how to spot where grouse had burrowed into snowdrifts for warmth. "Your people taught you this?" Caleb asked, genuinely impressed by her knowledge. "My grandfather," she replied softly, a mixture of pride and sadness in her voice. "He said the snow holds stories for those who know how to read them." The afternoon light was growing thin when they heard hoofbeats approaching. Caleb tensed instinctively, but relaxed upon recognizing Thomas Wheeler, a neighboring rancher, riding up to the cabin. "Evening, King!" Wheeler called out cheerfully, reining his horse to a stop. "Mighty fine day after all that snow." His friendly gaze took in Ahyoka without judgment, earning him a slight nod from Caleb. "What brings you out this way, Tom?" "News from the settlement," Wheeler answered, rubbing his gloved hands together for warmth. "Having a barn dance day after tomorrow. Thought you might want to know. Everyone's welcome," he added, including Ahyoka in his invitation with a polite tip of his hat. Caleb hesitated, glancing at his companion. To his surprise, Ayoka's eyes had brightened at the mention of dancing, though she remained silent. "Might do us good to get out," he said carefully, watching her reaction. When she gave a small nod, he turned back to Wheeler. "Reckon we'll be there?" "Fine thing!" Wheeler exclaimed, gathering his reins. "Sarah's bringing her apple pies. Starts at sundown." With a wave, he turned his horse and headed back down the trail. After he'd gone, Caleb and Ahyoka walked slowly back toward the cabin. Small snowflakes had begun falling, drifting lazily in the still air. "Been a while since I've been to a dance," Caleb admitted, brushing snow from his shoulders as they reached the porch. "I haven't danced since I was a child," Ahyoka said quietly, watching the snowflakes swirl around them. "At gatherings before—" She trailed off, but Caleb understood what she left unsaid. "We'll keep it simple," he assured her, holding the cabin door open. "Just good folks enjoying music and company. Nothing fancy required." Inside, they moved through their evening routine, building up the fire, preparing a simple supper, settling in as darkness gathered outside. The snow continued falling, soft and peaceful, muffling the world beyond their warm shelter. Neither spoke much, but the silence between them felt comfortable, filled with the quiet understanding that had begun growing between them. Dawn broke over the mountains in ribbons of pale gold, painting the snow-covered landscape in brilliant light. The mercury had dropped well below freezing overnight, leaving frost patterns etched across the cabin's windows like delicate lace. Inside, Caleb stood before the small mirror he'd mounted near the wash basin, carefully stropping his straight razor against the leather belt. The blade needed extra attention this morning. He hadn't given much thought to his appearance lately, but a barn dance called for proper grooming. Steam rose from the hot water he'd heated on the stove as he worked the lather into his stubbled jaw. In the main room, he could hear Ahyoka moving about, the rustle of fabric accompanying her footsteps. She'd discovered an old trunk in the storage room the day before, containing items left behind by previous occupants. Among them was a simple calico dress in shades of blue and cream. Though worn in places, it was still serviceable. Now she sat near the window, where the morning light was strongest, carefully mending a loose seam. Her small fingers moved with precision, the needle flashing silver as she worked. The dress lay across her lap like a pool of faded flowers. Caleb finished his shaving and changed into his better shirt, the crisp white one he saved for special occasions. He'd even polished his boots the night before, though he knew they'd likely be scuffed by evening's end. As the afternoon wore on, they prepared for the journey into town. Caleb saddled both Belle and his own gelding, checking the cinches twice against the bitter cold. The horse's breath came out in great white plumes, their coats fluffed up against the chill. Ahyoka emerged from the cabin, wearing the newly mended dress, a thick shawl wrapped tight around her shoulders. She'd braided her long dark hair into a single plait that hung down her back. Something about seeing her in the dress instead of her usual borrowed work clothes made Caleb pause, struck by how young and almost hopeful she looked. The ride into town took longer than usual, as they kept the horses to a careful pace on the frozen ground. The sun was already setting when they reached the settlement, painting the snow-covered buildings in shades of rose and amber. From the large barn at the edge of town came the sound of a fiddle being tuned, accompanied by the warm glow of lantern light spilling from its windows. They dismounted and led their horses to the temporary corral that had been set up for the evening. Inside the barn, the space had been transformed. Lanterns hung from the rafters, casting a golden glow over the swept wooden floor. Hay bales lined the walls as makeshift seating, and tables groaned under the weight of covered dishes and steaming coffee pots. As they stepped through the wide doors, several people called out greetings. "King, good to see you out and about." Tom Wheeler's voice boomed over the general chatter. Other neighbors approached, shaking Caleb's hand warmly. Ahyoka drew curious glances, but nothing unkind. The local folk were too well-mannered for that, and Caleb's presence beside her seemed to grant her a measure of acceptance. Sarah Wheeler even came forward with a gentle smile, offering them both cups of hot cider. The fiddle struck up a proper tune, joined by someone's guitar and a harmonica. Couples began moving onto the floor, and Caleb turned to Ahyoka with an awkward half bow. "Might not be much good at this," he warned her, But would you care to dance? She nodded, setting aside her cup and placing her small hand in his larger one. Caleb led her onto the floor, trying to remember the steps to a simple waltz. His first attempt at turning her nearly ended in disaster, but Ayoka managed to keep her feet. And then, the sound surprised them both. She laughed. It was a clear, bright sound, like spring water over stones. Caleb found himself grinning in response, his stiff movements loosening as they settled into the rhythm. They weren't the most graceful pair on the floor, but they managed to avoid any serious mishaps. The evening passed in a blur of music and movement. They danced several more times, and in between, found comfortable spots on the hay bales to rest and watch the others. Ayoka's eyes followed the dancers with evident enjoyment, her foot tapping in time to the livelier tunes. She even accepted a piece of Sarah Wheeler's famous apple pie, eating it with obvious appreciation. When the hour grew late and the younger children began nodding off in corners, Caleb and Ahyoka took their leave. The night air hit them like a shock after the barn's warmth, and overhead, the stars gleamed like ice crystals in the black sky. Their breath frosted in the air as they retrieved their horses and mounted up for the ride home. Neither spoke much on the journey back, but it was a comfortable silence. Every time Caleb glanced over, he could see Ahyoka's smile lingering in the starlight. Something had shifted between them, as if the music and warmth had thawed more than just the winter chill. The cabin welcomed them home with its familiar silhouette against the star-strewn sky. As they tended to the horses and prepared for sleep, Caleb found himself hoping that perhaps they had indeed turned a corner, that maybe, just maybe, Ahyoka had found a measure of peace in their simple celebration. Morning arrived with bitter intensity, the kind of cold that made bones ache and breath freeze. The thermometer outside the cabin window had dropped well below zero during the night, and frost had crept across the glass in thick crystalline patterns. Caleb pulled on 2 pairs of wool socks before stepping into his heavy boots. He tugged his warmest coat close around his neck and grabbed the axe from its place by the door. The woodpile needed replenishing after the previous night's efforts to keep the cabin warm. Inside, Ahyoka knelt by the hearth, carefully arranging kindling beneath the larger logs. Her movements were precise, practiced, evidence of long experience tending fires. The flames caught quickly under her attention, spreading warmth through the small space. The axe rang out against the frozen wood, each strike sending splinters flying. Caleb's breath came out in great white clouds as he worked, his shoulders burning with the effort. The exercise at least kept him warm, though his fingers grew numb despite his thick gloves. By midday, the weak winter sun had climbed as high as it would get. Caleb came inside to warm his hands by the fire, and Ahyoka handed him a cup of hot coffee. They shared a simple meal of bread and dried beef before preparing to check the fence lines. "North section needs looking at," Caleb said, pulling his coat back on. "Snow's been drifting bad up there." Ahyoka nodded, already wrapping her thick shawl around her shoulders. They saddled their horses quickly, not wanting to leave the animals standing in the bitter cold any longer than necessary. Belle stamped her hooves impatiently while Ahyoka mounted, eager to move and generate some warmth. The ride north was challenging. Deep drifts forced them to pick their way carefully along the ridge, and the wind cut straight through their layers of clothing. When they reached the fence line, they found their concerns justified. A 30-foot section had collapsed under the weight of packed snow. "Here," Caleb called over the wind, passing Ahyoka a coil of wire from his saddlebag. They worked together with practiced efficiency, she bracing the posts while he rewired the connections. When he struggled with cold, numb fingers, she stepped in to help, her smaller hands managing the delicate work while he held the posts steady. The sun was already sliding toward the horizon when they finished the repairs. Despite the brutal cold, they shared a sense of satisfaction in the work completed. Ahyoka even smiled as they mounted up for the return journey, her cheeks red from the wind, but her eyes bright. That feeling of accomplishment lasted until they crested the final hill overlooking the ranch. Caleb pulled his horse up short, feeling the animal tense beneath him. Beside him, he heard Ahyoka's sharp intake of breath. Smoke rose from the barn roof in an ominous gray spiral. The corral gate hung askew, one hinge torn completely free. Even from this distance, they could see the chicken coop had been reduced to splintered wood and scattered straw. Feathers dotted the snow like drops of blood. Caleb's hand went to the rifle in his saddle holster. "Stay close," he ordered, and a Hyoka guided Belle nearer to his gelding as they approached the ranch yard. The destruction became clearer with each step. Boot prints and horse tracks crisscrossed the snow, telling a story of multiple riders. The water trough had been overturned, its contents now a sheet of ice. A broken lantern lay in pieces near the barn door. They dismounted cautiously. Caleb checked the barn first, rifle ready, but found only frightened horses and the smoldering remains of a hay bale that had been deliberately set alight. The smoke was already thinning in the cold air. The fire had burned out before catching the whole structure. The cabin door stood open, swinging slightly in the wind. Inside, chaos reigned. Every drawer had been pulled out and upended, their contents strewn across the floor. The quilts on the bed had been slashed, stuffing spilling out like pale entrails. Dishes lay shattered on the floorboards. But it was the message above the hearth that drew their eyes. Carved deep into the solid log, the words stood out stark and threatening. "The mute belongs to us." Ahyoka's face went pale, but her jaw tightened with anger rather than fear. She moved through the wreckage with careful steps, gathering what could be salvaged. Caleb watched her for a moment, noting the trembling she tried to hide, before turning to assess the full extent of the damage. They worked in tense silence, straightening what they could. The chickens that survived were rounded up and secured in a makeshift pen within the barn. The broken gate was propped closed with rope and boards. Inside, they swept up broken glass and gathered scattered belongings. As darkness fell, they barricaded the cabin door and built up the fire. Caleb cleaned his rifle at the table, while Ahyoka pieced together a meal from their remaining supplies. The threat carved into the wall seemed to watch them, a constant reminder that their peace had been shattered. Neither spoke much as they ate, but their silence held volumes. The message was clear. Sutter's men had found them, and they weren't going to let Ahyoka go easily. Their small sanctuary had been violated, marked by violence and menace. The simple happiness of the previous evening's dance felt like a distant memory. The destruction left behind by Sutter's men cast long shadows as evening approached. Caleb gathered what tools remained and set to work on the broken door, his movements precise despite his exhaustion. The hollow sound of his hammer echoed through the cabin as he nailed boards across the splintered wood. Ahyoka moved methodically through the rooms, her broom sweeping broken glass into neat piles. The shards clinked together like bitter wind chimes. She worked without complaint, though her eyes constantly darted to the windows, watching the gathering darkness beyond. "We'll take shifts tonight," Caleb said, testing the strength of his repair work. 4 hours each. I'll take first watch." Ahyoka nodded, reaching for one of the rifles they'd positioned strategically around the cabin. She checked the ammunition with practiced hands, then set it within easy reach of the kitchen table. The familiar weight of the weapon offered small comfort against the threat lurking in the darkness. They ate a simple supper of beans and hardtack, neither speaking much. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting dancing shadows on the carved thread above. Outside, the temperature dropped steadily as night settled in. Caleb took up his position near the front window, rifle across his knees. Ahyoka wrapped herself in what remained of the quilts and tried to rest on the floor near the fire, though sleep proved elusive. Every creak of the cabin's timbers, every whistle of wind through the makeshift repairs brought them both to alert attention. When Ahyoka's turn came, she stationed herself by the east-facing window, where the moon cast enough light to see any approach. Caleb slept fitfully nearby, one hand never far from his weapon. The night stretched long and cold, but passed without incident. Dawn arrived with steel-gray clouds and the promise of more snow. After a hurried breakfast, Caleb saddled his gelding, securing his rifle in its scabbard. "I'm riding to the Henderson place," he told Ahyoka, checking his pistol before settling it in his holster. "They'll likely spare some lumber, and they should know about this trouble. Other neighbors, too." Ahyoka stood in the doorway, her own rifle ready. "Be careful," she said softly. "They could be watching." Caleb mounted up, scanning the tree line. "Bar the door behind me. I'll knock 3 times, pause." Then twice more when I return." She nodded, memorizing the signal. As Caleb rode out, she secured what remained of the door and set about continuing yesterday's repairs. There was plenty to keep her hands busy while her mind stayed alert for danger. Throughout the day, she worked steadily. The chicken coop needed complete rebuilding, but she managed to fashion a temporary shelter using salvaged boards and canvas. She gathered scattered tools and straightened the tack room in the barn, all while keeping watch over the surrounding landscape. The sun had passed its peak when she heard hoofbeats approaching. She positioned herself behind the barn door, rifle ready, until she heard the promised knock sequence. Relief flooded through her as she unbarred the door to admit Caleb. He carried fresh lumber across his saddle, along with a bag of supplies donated by concerned neighbors. But it was the news in his eyes that caught her attention as he secured his horse. "Found tracks," he said, helping her carry the lumber inside. "Fresh ones heading north. They lead toward that narrow canyon past Sutter's property." Ayoka's expression hardened. She knew the place, a steep-walled passage that wound through the mountains. "Not many ways through there," she said. "Easy place for an ambush." They prepared a late meal, discussing their options over bowls of hot stew. The wind had picked up outside, carrying the promise of another storm. "Law won't help us," Caleb said grimly. "And neighbors, willing as they are, have their own places to protect." Ayoka stirred her stew thoughtfully. "That canyon," she began, then paused, considering her words. "I know those paths, the old ones my people used. There are ways through that most don't see." Caleb studied her face in the firelight. "You're suggesting we go after them ourselves." She met his gaze steadily. "Waiting won't make us safer. They'll come back, maybe with more men next time." The fire popped and crackled as they weighed the dangers. Outside, the wind moaned through gaps in the repairs, a lonely sound that emphasized their isolation. "It's dangerous ground," Caleb said finally. "But you're right. We can't just sit here waiting for help that might never come." They spent the remaining daylight preparing. Caleb checked their weapons while Ayoka packed supplies they could carry easily on horseback. They would need to travel light and fast, ready to move at a moment's notice. Night fell early, brought on by the gathering storm clouds. They took turns sleeping again, but this time their rest was purposeful, gathering strength for what lay ahead. The wind continued its mournful song through the cabin's damaged walls, but neither Caleb nor Ayoka let it disturb their resolve. Each time they switched watches, they refined their plans. Ayoka sketched crude maps in the hearth ash, showing Caleb the hidden trails she remembered. He described what he'd seen of the tracks, helping her piece together their enemy's likely route. They were no longer just survivors defending their home. They had become hunters, preparing to take the fight to those who had violated their peace. The threat carved above the fireplace seemed less menacing now, a desperate act by men who would soon learn the cost of their actions. The night passed slowly, marked by the regular changing of their watches and the howling of the wind. But unlike the previous night's tense vigilance, their wakefulness now had purpose. They were ready for what would come with the dawn. The eastern sky had barely begun to lighten when Caleb and Ayoka started their preparations. Dawn painted the snow-covered landscape in shades of pale blue and gray, their breath forming white clouds in the frigid morning air. They worked quickly but methodically, knowing each moment counted. Ayoka packed dried meat, hardtack, and water skins into their saddlebags, while Caleb checked their weapons one final time. The rifles were cleaned and loaded, extra ammunition carefully distributed between them. They wouldn't have time to return for forgotten supplies. "The snow stopped just before midnight," Ayoka said, adjusting Belle's saddle straps. "Their tracks will still be clear." Caleb nodded, leading his gelding from the barn. "How far to the canyon?" 4 hours, maybe 5 with the drifts." She swung into Belle's saddle with practiced ease, her eyes already scanning the northern horizon. "We should move fast. The weather could turn again." They set out as the sun crested the mountains, leaving the ransacked cabin behind. Ayoka took the lead, her smaller frame bent low over Belle's neck as she studied the snow-covered ground. The horses moved carefully through the deep drifts. their hooves breaking through the crusty surface. The morning remained clear but bitterly cold. Every few hundred yards, Ayoka would pause, pointing out signs to Caleb. Here, a set of hoofprints veering west. There, the deeper impression where a heavily laden horse had struggled through deeper snow. The trail wasn't difficult to follow. Their quarry had made no attempt to hide their passage. "They're confident," Caleb observed, noting the straight path the tracks took. "Or foolish." "Both, maybe," Ayoka replied, her voice tight. "They think no one would dare follow." As they rode higher into the foothills, the wind grew sharper, carrying the bite of the mountains. The tracks led them through stands of bare aspens and snow-laden pines, always trending northward. Ayoka's expertise showed in how she read the subtle signs: broken branches, displaced snow, the occasional dropped item marking their enemy's path. Near mid-morning, they came upon clear evidence of the stolen cattle, churned snow, and distinct hoofprints where the animals had been driven through a narrow pass. Ayoka dismounted to examine the tracks more closely. "At least 6 riders," she said, tracing the patterns with her gloved hand. "They're pushing the cattle hard. See how deep these prints are? The animals were struggling." The canyon opened before them like a great white gash in the earth. Sheer rock walls rose on either side, their faces etched with ice and shadow. The wind funneled through the narrow space, whipping up loose snow in stinging clouds. Ayoka's posture tensed as they entered the canyon proper. Her eyes constantly scanned the heights above them, alert for any movement. Caleb understood her caution. In these close quarters, an ambush would be deadly. They rode in silence for another hour, the canyon walls pressing closer. The sun barely reached the canyon floor now, leaving them in a perpetual twilight. Both riders kept their rifles close, ready for trouble. Just past noon, Ayoka raised her hand in warning. Caleb reined his gelding to a stop beside her. She pointed silently toward the sky ahead, where a thin tendril of smoke rose above the canyon rim. They exchanged a look, no words needed. Caleb gestured to a sheltered hollow off the main trail, partially hidden by a fallen pine. They led their horses carefully into the natural hideaway, securing them where they would be protected from both weather and discovery. "We go on foot from here," Caleb whispered, checking his pistol before tucking it securely in its holster. "Stay low. Stay quiet." Ayoka nodded, slinging her rifle across her back. They moved forward through the snow, using what cover they could find. The smoke grew more distinct as they approached, and soon they could smell wood smoke on the wind. A massive boulder provided their final hiding place. Crouching behind it, they could observe the camp without being seen. 3 men huddled around a small fire in a natural alcove, partially protected from the wind by an overhanging cliff face. 2 were strangers to Caleb, rough-looking men with trail-worn clothes and heavy revolvers at their hips. The third made Ayoka's breath catch. A man she clearly recognized from her former pack, his face weathered and cruel in the firelight. They watched in silence as the men talked among themselves, their voices carried away by the wind. Several horses were picketed nearby, and beyond them, Caleb could make out the shapes of the stolen cattle, huddled against the canyon wall. After several long minutes, Caleb touched Ayoka's arm and motioned for retreat. They crawled backward until they were safely out of sight, then made their way quickly back to their horses. "We can't take them, not just the 2 of us," Caleb said once they reached their mounts. "They're armed and expecting trouble. We need help." Ayoka's face was grim as she checked Belle's cinch. "They'll have moved on by the time we return with others." "Maybe," Caleb agreed, "but we know their trail now, and they have to come out of this canyon eventually." He paused, studying the canyon walls. "Better to face them with numbers on our side than risk everything in a fight we might not win." Ayoka nodded reluctantly, knowing he was right. The discovery of her former packmate had shaken her more than she wanted to admit. These men were dangerous. They would need every advantage they could get. The decision made, they prepared to backtrack. The afternoon was wearing on, and they would need to move quickly to reach help before darkness fell. As they mounted up, both kept watching the thin column of smoke rising above the canyon rim, a marker for their return and a promise that this fight wasn't over. Caleb and Ayoka pushed their horses through the gathering darkness. the moon casting just enough light to follow the snow-packed trail. The temperature dropped steadily as night deepened, their breath freezing in their scarves. They rode close together, alert for any sound that might signal pursuit. "Elias Morton's ranch lies just beyond that ridge," Caleb said during a brief rest, pointing to a dark line against the star-filled sky. "He's a good man, trustworthy." Ayoka nodded, her face half hidden in the shadows. "Will he believe us about Sutter?" "He's had his own run-ins with that snake," Caleb replied, urging his gelding forward. "And he knows something's been wrong in the valley for months." They pressed on through the night, their horses' hooves making soft crunching sounds in the packed snow. The eastern sky was just beginning to lighten when they crested the final hill overlooking the Morton ranch. Smoke rose from the chimney of the main house, and lantern light glowed in the barn windows where early morning chores were already underway. Elias Morton himself stepped out of the barn as they rode into the yard, his weathered face creasing with concern at their unexpected arrival. He was a tall man, with gray-streaked hair and careful movements that spoke of years working cattle. "Caleb!" he called out, walking toward them. "What brings you out at this hour?" Caleb dismounted, helping Ayoka down from her tired mare. "Trouble, Elias? The kind that needs more than 2 guns to solve?" Inside the warm kitchen, while Mrs. Morton prepared coffee and breakfast, Caleb explained the situation. Elias listened intently, his expression growing darker as he heard about the ransacked ranch and the men hiding in the canyon. "John," he called to his eldest son who stood in the doorway, "ride over to the Hendersons and the Taylors. Tell them we need help and be quick about it." The young man nodded and disappeared, the sound of hoofbeats soon fading into the distance. Mrs. Morton, a kind-faced woman with capable hands, guided Ayoka to a chair by the fire. "You both look exhausted. The bunkhouse is warm. You should rest while we wait for the others." In the quiet of the bunkhouse, Ayoka couldn't sleep despite her exhaustion. She sat with Mrs. Morton, who had followed to bring them extra blankets, and found herself telling the older woman everything about Sutter's manipulation of land claims, the false documents, the threats against her people. "He's been stealing from both sides," Ayoka explained, her voice low but clear. "Using forged permits to take Apache grazing land, then selling those same rights to ranchers. The ledger proves it all. Every transaction, every bribe." Mrs. Morton's face showed both sympathy and anger. "No wonder he wanted to keep you quiet, dear. That man's been poisoning this valley for too long." By midday, 5 riders had gathered in Morton's barn. Besides Caleb and Elias, there were the Henderson brothers, Tom and Frank, both experienced ranchers, and Will Taylor, whose family had lost cattle to mysterious rustlers twice in the past year. They spread out a rough map on a hay bale, while Caleb outlined his plan. "The canyon has 2 approaches," he explained, pointing to the crude drawing. "The main trail we followed, and a steeper path that comes down from the north." "We split into 2 groups," Elias added, nodding. "Cut off any chance of escape. They won't be expecting anyone to come from the high trail." The men discussed positions and timing, checking their weapons and ammunition. Ayoka contributed her knowledge of the canyon's layout, marking spots where the walls narrowed or where natural shelter might hide their quarry. "The snow works in our favor," she said, glancing at the cloudy sky through the barn door. "They'll have trouble spotting us until we're close, and their tracks will be clear if they try to run." They rode out as heavy clouds rolled in from the west, the air thick with the promise of snow. The group split at a fork in the trail, Caleb, Ayoka, and Elias taking the main path, while the others began the long climb to the northern approach. The afternoon light faded quickly under the leaden sky. They reached the canyon mouth just as true darkness began to fall, making camp in a sheltered grove of pines well back from the main trail. No fires were lit. They shared cold rations and took turns keeping watch. Ayoka sat wrapped in her blanket, back against a tree trunk, listening to the wind moving through the canyon. The air had grown heavier, and she could smell snow coming. Beside her, Caleb cleaned his rifle with practiced movements, his face thoughtful in the dim light. Elias returned from checking the horses, settling down nearby. "Storm's moving in," he whispered. "We'll need to move before it hits, or their tracks will be lost." They all knew what was at stake, not just the stolen cattle, but the evidence that could finally bring Sutter's crimes to light. The ledger, if they could recover it, would protect both rancher and Apache lands from further theft. The night deepened around their silent camp, each person lost in their own thoughts. Snow began to fall in lazy spirals, adding to the hushed atmosphere. Tomorrow would bring action and danger, but for now, they waited, watching white flakes disappear into the darkness. Gray light seeped into the canyon as dawn approached, revealing a world draped in fresh snow. The air hung sharp and cold, each breath visible in crystalline puffs. Caleb checked his Winchester rifle one final time before dividing their group. He and Ayoka would take the western ridge, while Elias led the others along the eastern approach. "Remember," Caleb whispered to the gathered men, "we want them alive if possible. The ledger's our real target." He turned to Ayoka, noting the determined set of her jaw. "Ready?" She nodded, adjusting the borrowed pistol at her hip. They began their careful ascent of the western slope, boots crunching through the crusty surface of the snow. The ridge offered a clear view of the canyon floor below, where thin streams of smoke rose from a dying campfire. Through his field glasses, Caleb counted 3 men moving around the camp. They were loading supplies onto a crude wooden sled, working with the hurried movements of men planning a quick departure. "They know we're coming," Ayoka whispered, crouching beside him behind a snow-dusted boulder. "See how they keep looking toward the canyon mouth?" Caleb nodded. The thieves' nervous glances and rushed preparations told him their element of surprise wasn't completely lost. Still, with both exits covered, they held the advantage. They watched as Elias and his group worked their way into position across the canyon. The morning light strengthened, casting long shadows across the snow. Caleb raised his rifle, using the scope to study each man below. He recognized one as Jim Hawley, one of Sutter's regular hands. The others were strangers, probably hired guns brought in for this job. When Elias's group was in place, Caleb drew his revolver. The familiar weight of the Colt single-action army steadied his hand. He lifted the rifle to his shoulder, aimed at the sky, and squeezed the trigger. The shot cracked through the morning stillness like breaking ice. Below, the thieves spun toward the sound, hands flying to their weapons. Before they could react further, Elias and his men emerged from cover, rifles leveled. "Drop your guns!" Elias's voice boomed off the canyon walls. "You're surrounded!" Instead of surrendering, one of the strangers dove behind the sled, firing wildly with a revolver. The other 2 scattered, seeking cover behind rocks and fallen trees. The sharp reports of gunfire echoed deafeningly in the confined space. Caleb sighted carefully on Hawley, who was trying to work his way toward a narrow side trail. "Last chance!" he shouted. "Throw down your weapons!" More shots answered him, sparking off the rocks near his position. Beside him, Ayoka pointed to a dark opening in the canyon wall. "That cave! They kept looking that way! The ledger must be there!" Caleb nodded. "Go, I'll cover you." She moved like a shadow across the snow, while Caleb fired steadily, keeping the thieves pinned down. The Henderson brothers were working their way down the eastern slope, forcing the outlaws to divide their attention. Ayoka reached the cave entrance just as one of the strangers noticed her movement. He swung his gun toward her, but Caleb's shot kicked up snow at his feet, making him duck back behind a boulder. Inside the cave, Ayoka's eyes adjusted quickly to the gloom. Supplies were stacked against one wall, stolen goods from their ranch and others. Behind a pile of saddles, she found what they sought, a leather-bound ledger wrapped carefully in oilskin. The gunfight outside intensified. She heard shouts, the continuing crack of revolvers, the heavier boom of rifles. Clutching the ledger to her chest, she peered out of the cave. Caleb had worked his way down to the canyon floor and was now locked in a desperate struggle with Hawley. They crashed through the snow, trading punches, neither able to bring their weapons to bear. The other men were engaged in their own battles. One of the strangers lay wounded in the snow, while the third had disappeared up the side trail. Elias Morton was moving among the frightened cattle, speaking softly to calm them, while keeping his rifle trained on the remaining threat. The Henderson brothers approached the wounded man carefully, collecting his weapons. Ayoka circled wide around the fighting, making her way toward Elias. She had almost reached him when a shot rang out from above. The escaped man had gained higher ground and was taking aim at the group below. "Look out!" she shouted, diving behind a fallen log. The warning came just in time. Elias dropped flat as a bullet whined overhead. Tom Henderson returned fire, forcing the shooter to retreat further into the rocks. They heard the sound of a horse being mounted, then hoofbeats fading into the distance. Near the sled, Caleb finally got the upper hand on Holly, driving him face first into a snowbank. "Stay down," he growled, pressing his knee into the man's back while he bound his hands with a leather strap. The sudden silence felt explosive after the chaos of the fight. Snow began falling again, soft flakes settling on the churned-up battlefield. Ayoka emerged from behind the log, still clutching the precious ledger. "Got it," she called to Caleb, holding up the oilskin package. "Everything's here. All his records just like I remembered." Elias finished securing the second prisoner, while Frank Henderson tended to the wounded man. The cattle, though agitated, had been kept from stampeding by the canyon walls. "One got away," Tom Henderson reported, returning from a quick scout up the trail. "Heading east, probably making for Sutter's store." Caleb helped Holly to his feet, studying the man's sullen face. "Which means we need to move fast. Sutter will know something's wrong as soon as his man reaches him." They worked quickly to gather evidence and prepare for travel. The wounded man was helped onto one of the spare horses, while Holly and his fellow prisoner were tied to their own mounts. Elias organized the others to drive the recovered cattle, leaving Frank Henderson to escort the prisoners to the sheriff. "We ride for Sutter's," Caleb announced, checking his ammunition. "Better face him now before he has time to destroy more evidence or call in reinforcements." Ayoka secured the ledger in her saddlebag, then mounted Belle. The mare danced beneath her, picking up on the tension in the air. Morning was fully upon them now, the storm clouds breaking to reveal patches of cold blue sky. They set out with purpose, leaving the canyon behind. The ledger's weight against Ayoka's leg felt like hope, proof at last of all Sutter's crimes. But she knew the hardest part still lay ahead. The corrupt traitor wouldn't give up his power without a fight. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the snow-packed trail as their unusual procession made its way toward Wolf Creek. Caleb and Ayoka rode at the front, while Elias Morton helped guide the recovered cattle. Behind them, the two bound prisoners swayed in their saddles, watched carefully by Tom Henderson's steady rifle. The stolen cattle moved slowly through the deep snow, their breath creating clouds of steam in the cold air. Every so often, one would try to break away from the group, but Elias's experienced handling kept them together. The ledger remained secure in Ayoka's saddlebag, each step bringing them closer to justice. As they approached the outskirts of town, people began emerging from their homes and businesses. Word of the morning's confrontation had somehow already spread through Wolf Creek. Neighbors and ranchers gathered along the street, pointing and whispering as the group passed. "Look there!" someone called out. "Those are the Mortons' missing cattle." Another voice rose from the crowd. "Those men were working for Sutter." The growing crowd followed them toward the sheriff's office, their numbers swelling as more townspeople joined. Caleb noticed how some kept their distance, likely those with ties to Sutter's operations. Others stepped forward, offering words of support or sharing their own stories of missing stock and suspicious dealings. Outside the sheriff's office, Caleb dismounted first, helping Ayoka down from Belle. She kept one hand on the saddlebag containing the ledger, her expression determined. Elias and Tom brought the prisoners, marching them through the gathering crowd. Sheriff Wade looked up from his desk as they entered, his weathered face showing little surprise. He'd clearly heard they were coming. The small office quickly grew cramped as Caleb, Ayoka, and Elias crowded in with their prisoners. "What's all this about?" the sheriff asked, though his tone suggested he already knew. Caleb stepped forward. "These men were caught stealing cattle. They've been working for Bill Sutter." The sheriff's gaze slid to the bound men, then back to Caleb. "That's a serious accusation, King. You got proof?" Ayoka moved to the sheriff's desk, pulling the oilskin-wrapped ledger from her bag. Her hands were steady as she unwrapped it and placed it before him. The leather-bound book landed with a solid thump that seemed to echo in the sudden silence. "Everything's in here," she said clearly. her voice carrying the weight of long-held truth. Years of fraud, false claims, stolen cattle, forged documents, all of it in Sutter's own hand. Sheriff Wade stared at her for a long moment, likely surprised to hear her speak. Then he opened the ledger, beginning to flip through its pages. His expression remained neutral, but his fingers tightened on the paper as he read. The prisoners shifted uncomfortably as minutes ticked by. Outside, they could hear the murmur of the crowd, still gathering in the street. The oil lamp on the sheriff's desk cast flickering shadows across the walls. Finally, Wade looked up. "This is mighty detailed," he admitted grudgingly. "Names, dates, amounts, enough to build a solid case." He glanced at the prisoners. "You boys want to tell me your side?" Jim Hawley, his face still bruised from his fight with Caleb, spat on the floor. "Ain't saying nothing without Sutter here." "You'll have plenty of time to talk," Wade replied, standing up. "For now, you're spending the night in my cells." He gestured to his deputy, who began leading the prisoners toward the back of the building. Turning back to Caleb and the others, the sheriff's face showed resignation. "Reckon I can't ignore this anymore. That ledger's enough to end Sutter's grip on this town." He carefully closed the book, locking it in his desk drawer. "I'll send word to the territorial marshal first thing tomorrow." Elias stepped forward. "You make sure that ledger stays safe, Wade. Too many folks have suffered to get it here." The sheriff met his gaze steadily. "It'll be secure. You have my word on that." Outside, the crowd had begun to disperse as darkness fell. Snow was starting to fall again, thick flakes swirling in the lamplight. Caleb and Ayoka helped Elias settle the recovered cattle in the town livery, making sure they were fed and watered after their long journey. "You'll stay with us tonight," Elias insisted as they finished. "Martha's already preparing the spare room. You both look dead on your feet." Too exhausted to argue, they followed him to the Morton Ranch just outside town. The warmth of the house enveloped them as they entered, carrying the scent of fresh bread and coffee. Martha Morton welcomed them with hot food and quiet efficiency, asking no questions about their obvious fatigue. The spare room was small but comfortable, with a clean bed and thick quilts. Ayoka sank onto the edge of the mattress, finally allowing her shoulders to slump. Caleb sat beside her, their arms just touching. Neither spoke for a long while, listening to the soft sounds of the house settling and the muffled voices of the Morton family moving about downstairs. Outside their window, snow continued to fall, coating the world in thick silence. The events of the day seemed to hover in the quiet between them. The fight in the canyon, the recovery of the ledger, the sheriff's reluctant acceptance of the truth. They had succeeded beyond their hopes, yet both knew tomorrow would bring new challenges. Ayoka leaned slightly against Caleb's shoulder, too tired for words but drawing comfort from his solid presence. He understood, remaining still and steady beside her as the snow fell and the night deepened around them. In the Morton spare room, they found a moment of peace after the long day's struggles. The ledger was secure, the evidence safe in the sheriff's custody. It was enough for now, to rest and gather strength for whatever the morning might bring. A week passed like water flowing over stones. Each morning brought new faces to Wolf Creek as territorial agents arrived from the capital, their polished boots and crisp uniforms standing out against the town's weathered buildings. They came with leather portfolios and stern expressions, setting up temporary offices in the back of the general store. Sutter's downfall happened with surprising speed. The agents found even more evidence of his schemes hidden in his store's basement, forged deeds, altered contracts, and letters revealing a web of corruption that stretched across 3 counties. When they led him away in irons, he seemed smaller somehow, his shoulders hunched against the winter wind. The agents worked methodically, reviewing every claim and deed. One by one, ranchers and native families came forward to reclaim what was rightfully theirs. Land stolen through false debts returned to its proper owners. Cattle herds were restored, grazing rights reinstated. The weight of Sutter's greed lifted from the valley like winter fog, burning away in morning sun. At Caleb's ranch, life settled into a gentle rhythm. Each day brought new tasks as they worked to erase the damage from the raid. Ayoka helped him replace broken boards in the barn, her sure hand steady with hammer and nails. They built a new chicken coop together, stronger than the old one, and filled it with fresh-bought hens that scratched contentedly in the yard. The days grew longer, and hints of approaching spring appeared in subtle ways. A warming breeze here, a patch of bare ground there. Snow still blanketed the higher pastures, but winter's grip was loosening. Ahyoka's smile came more readily now, her laughter brightening their shared meals and quiet evenings. Caleb found himself watching the changes in her as much as the turning of seasons. She moved through the ranch with growing confidence. No longer a guest, but someone who belonged. He caught himself thinking of garden plots and summer flowers, of how she might like a proper rose bush by the front door when the ground thawed. One evening, they sat before the hearth, the familiar task of mending tack keeping their hands busy while the fire crackled softly. Ayoka worked at a stubborn piece of leather, her fingers moving with practiced grace. The lamplight caught the curve of her cheek, the slight furrow of concentration between her brows. "I'll stay," she said quietly, not looking up from her work. Her voice was gentle but certain. "If you want me to." Caleb's hand stilled on the bridle he was oiling. The fire popped, sending sparks dancing up the chimney. Outside, a night wind whispered through the pines, but here in the warmth of their shared home, everything felt still and clear. "I do," he answered simply, his voice carrying all the weight of a promise. Spring crept into the high valley like a gentle awakening. The land shed its white winter blanket, revealing patches of earth that grew wider with each passing day. Morning frost gave way to dewy grass, tender green shoots pushing through thawed soil. The air changed too, carrying the rich scent of mud and new growth, mixing with the ever-present pine and clean mountain wind. Caleb watched the transformation from his cabin porch each dawn, noting how the sunrise touched different peaks as it moved northward with the season. The cattle grew restless in their winter pasture, lowing at the sight of fresh grass. New calves appeared almost daily now, their spindly legs trembling as they learned to stand, mothers hovering close by. But the most anticipated arrival came from Belle, their gentle bay mare. She had grown heavy through the winter months, her sides swelling with promise. Ayoka had taken special care of her, mixing extra grain into her feed and brushing her coat until it gleamed. When the foaling time approached, they took turns checking the barn through the night. Now, on this bright spring morning, Caleb and Ayoka stood side by side at the corral fence, watching Belle tend to her newborn foal. The little one was all legs and curiosity, its coat still damp from birth but already showing signs of its mother's rich bay color. Belle nickered softly, nudging her baby with infinite patience as it wobbled and tested its strength. The sun climbed higher, warming the fresh breeze. Around them, the ranch had begun to wake, chickens scratching in their new coop, cattle moving in the distant pasture, a meadowlark trilling from a fence post. The mountains stood guard as always, their snow-capped peaks brilliant against the deep blue sky. "Ahyoka!" Caleb called softly, not wanting to startle the mare and foal. She turned toward him, and the morning light caught in her dark hair, bringing out hidden strands of copper. Her face held none of the shadows that had haunted it during those first difficult days. Instead, her eyes were clear and bright, reflecting the promise of the season. "I'm home," she answered without hesitation, her voice carrying the same quiet certainty as the spring wind. Together, they walked back toward the cabin, their boots leaving paired tracks in the damp earth. The window glowed with early lamplight, warm and welcoming against the fresh morning. Behind them, the mountains stood silent and eternal, watching over their valley as they had for countless springs before. The foal's tiny wicker followed them, a new voice adding to the symphony of their shared life. Thank you for being here. If something in this story stayed with you, I'd love to see you again. Subscribe, and tomorrow I'll bring you another story crafted with heart.